Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the ThieAudio Hype 2. Whatever happened to the Hype 1, I'm not sure. I don't think it existed, but this one does exist, and what it is a $300 IM that I think a lot of people that are getting into the hobby, if you're willing to spend this much money, I think the Hype 2 might be a very good place to start. So what it is a hybrid driver IM. It's got 4 drivers, 2 of them are balanced armatures and 2 of them are dynamic drivers, which is not entirely common to have 2 dynamic drivers in an IM. And what they're doing here with the Hype 2 is they've got it kind of in they call it an isobaric configuration, where I believe the 2 dynamic drivers are firing against each other, and it's supposed to contribute to better bass tactility and lower distortion and stuff like that. But does it actually do that? Well, for the past week or so, I've been listening to this IM, and let's talk about it. What else should I say about this thing? I mean, it's kind of interesting at its price point as a hybrid IM. It's priced pretty similarly to the Moondrop Blessing 3. And now, if you know anything about the Blessing 3, you know that the Blessing 3 is not a bassy IM, whereas I do think that the Hype 2 you could call bassy. But there is the Blessing 3 Dusk that everyone kind of knows is coming, which is going to be like ostensibly the more bassy version of the Blessing 3. And it's interesting that ThieAudio was able to sneak in the Hype 2 before the Dusk came out. And I don't know. Let's dig into it. So let's talk about the physical stuff on this IM first, and I will just start by describing this cable, it's a common cable I've seen on some other ThieAudio IMs, and I apologize for all that noise. But it is, I would say, a decent cable. It is a little bit on the stiff side, a little bit memory prone, but aesthetically, I think it actually looks really, really stinking nice. It is a really clean looking cable. It's got nice, clean hardware. Up here, you've got a small Y split. You've got a very functional chin slider, which again looks nice and handsome. And then, of course, up here, you've got your preformed ear hooks with your standard 2-pin connectors. So if you want to swap out the cable, certainly you can do that. This is a very standard, common cable connector that you can find all kinds of replacements for. But I don't know. I would say this is not an IM I would be super eager to replace the cable on, even though it is maybe a little bit stiff. And I'll do the little roadie wrap here on camera, and then I will slide it into view, so maybe you can see a little bit of the stiffness I'm talking about, or maybe, well, it'll just be really well behaved, as it is sometimes. So that's the cable. The earpieces themselves I actually think are really, really nice, and ThieAudio almost always does a really, really good job with their earpieces in terms of a couple of ways. So aesthetically, I think this thing looks pretty nice. It comes in 2 different colors. One of them is purple, one of them is this blue. And in photos, I thought that the purple looked kind of the coolest, but yeah, I like this blue one actually. There's a little bit of depth to it, not a ton, but a little bit of depth that I think makes it a little bit more interesting than I expected just based on the photos. But what I like even more about these earpieces is just the fit. So let me pull this thing up to my head. I'll throw it in the dome, and you can get a sense, at least somewhat, of exactly what this thing fits like in my ear. So like a lot of ThieAudio IMs, it is a semi-custom molded shape that has, some opinionation to it. Opinionation, is that a word? Did I just invent a word? I'm not sure. I'll have to look that one up afterward. But you see that it's got things like, it's got the anti-tragus catch here, which just means it's a little nubbin. It's going to connect to this little nubbin on an ear. It's also got a little bit of a wing back here, but what I like about the way that ThieAudio does this is that they do just enough to make it actually fit nice and stable in my ear, really, really secure, so it's not going to move around or anything like that, but they don't overdo it to the point that, it's overly aggressive or sharp and, going to be uncomfortable. Obviously, your ear is going to vary from my ear, so whether or not these things are 100% true for you, I can't predict, but I can say that generally people that I've recommended ThieAudio IMs to, based on the fit, have told me that they fit them pretty well too. So I think that is, I don't want to say it's a safe bet, but it's a pretty safe bet. What else can I say about the fit? I mean, the size on this, I would describe as like a medium size ear shape. It's not the smallest ThieAudio, something like the Legacy 2, the Legacy 4. I think those earpieces are a little bit smaller here than the Hype 2, but this thing is not overly large. I don't think many people will have any issues with fit and comfort on this thing. I didn't have any issues with it being, overly aggressive in terms of sealing. Isolation seemed pretty good. The only kind of strange thing about the physical form of this IM is that there is a little bit of if I tap on it right here, I hear like a little bit of a twang, which I think is, something inside the IM vibrating, which, I don't think it's a problem. But I guess if you feel it, if you try this thing in your ear and you feel a twang, it's probably perfectly normal. And this thing certainly measures perfectly normal, which is, I guess, going to get us into talking about the sound here on the Hype 2. And I already alluded to it a little bit, right? This is a bassy IM, or at least it's got like it's got a hefty bass boost. But let's let's pull up the frequency response real quick, which I think is this button. All right, cool. I was right. There was a good chance that was wrong, but anyway, this is the frequency response for the ThieAudio Hype 2. And what you can kind of see here is just like a neutral sound signature that's got a hefty bass boost, which is what you see down here. And that bass boost is starting pretty low, right? It's basically all below 150 hertz. If you're not super familiar with that, what that means, it just means like bass frequencies can honestly kind of start, as high as 250 hertz, right? This is where you get a lot of like your punch and your physicality in your bass, whereas down here it's much more in like the sub bass frequencies. So a lot of music doesn't actually have a ton of content in this frequency range, but if your music does, well, like a lot of electronic music especially, you're going to get like a decent bit of rumble here with the Hype. And I would say that this is actually not. Some of the bass boosts that you'll get are a little bit softer here and will slope up a little bit slower. And I don't want to get like too deep into analyzing the frequency response or using it as an explanation for everything. But what I will say is that based on this graph, and I think it does hold up to listening, the bass is a little bit meatier and a little bit more punchy than just purely a sub bass focus. So you do get a bit of that initial attack punch on this bass. Apart from that, well, again, it looks kind of like a neutral tuned IM. You got pretty decent treble extension up here. And that's more or less what it comes across in terms of listening experience. But what's interesting, what I think is a little bit different in listening versus what I predicted from the graph, is I think that the Hype 2 is not as mid-range focused as the graph suggests. I think that this is kind of somewhat of like a downward sloping sound signature, and maybe that's explained by, the treble being just, I don't know, it's very polite treble. I don't think anyone's going to have any issues with the sharpness or aggressiveness on the treble here. It is a little bit on the relaxed side or the easy side, and because of that, it just kind of, again, contributes to a sound that is, I think, more dominated by the bass than this graph might lead you to believe. So those are kind of like the qualities based on the frequency response. But I think what really stood out to me the first time I listened to the Hype 2 was the stereo imaging and the width on this IM, which is really pretty fantastic, honestly. I mean, look, as you go up in prices with IMs, and this isn't always the case, but just generally, things like stereo positioning, how wide, how far out from my ears does the sound, right? How strong is the distinction between the instruments, and how clearly are things in sort of like this 3D position around my head? And I think that the Hype 2 actually does a really outstanding job of that. That might make it really good for gaming. I'll just be honest, I have not played any games with these things. I'm just not much of a gamer with IMs. Mostly when I'm playing games, I don't know. I guess I don't fuss too much about the audio, which maybe is odd, but that's a story for another day. But yeah, honestly, the imaging on this thing is really just pretty fantastic. It is a treat. What I think is maybe lacking on the Hype 2 is honestly kind of comes down to more of nuanced stuff. So this is why I mentioned that this I think would be good for someone that's getting into the hobby and wants to be like immediately wowed with the audio, because I think the Hype 2 is going to do a really good job of that, provided you're listening to music that has some decent separation between sounds. But where I think it's maybe a little bit weak is in terms of, again, the nuances. So that bass right there that I mentioned it's well defined in that it's like separated from the rest of the sounds. It doesn't sound blurry or smut, like it's not blurring up the rest of the frequency response or anything like that. But the attack is a little bit on the soft side, which just means a little bit undefined, which was interesting because, again, you might remember I mentioned it's got that isobaric dynamic driver configuration, which is I ostensibly supposed to make the bass a little bit sharper. But I found that the bass is just a little bit on the soft side. And honestly, that kind of contributes, or that kind of holds true through the rest of the sound signature. The mid-range especially is just a little bit low on detail and texturing and that kind of stuff. And maybe that's all comes down to the somewhat relaxed treble. To be honest, I suspect that's probably what it is. I haven't played around with EQ to see if that's a thing that I can impact with EQ or just purely frequency response, but I suspect it is. But yeah, just generally, I think that the Hype 2, while again a very impressive and exciting IM, is not necessarily the best when it comes to those micro contrast details, which is interesting because I mentioned here this is the Blessing 3, and I apologize for any finger smudges. This is kind of the king at around $300. It's $320, so it's a little bit more expensive, but when it comes to mid-range texturing, just that micro contrast and really that feeling of transparency, I think the Blessing 3 is just, it's a next step above the Hype 2. Now, the Hype 2, I would say that the imaging on this thing is stronger. It's more standout, but it's, it's no slouch here on the Blessing 3. But again, if you're looking for more bass content than what you get here on the Blessing 3, because this is not a bassy IM, despite it having double dynamic drivers and also having a very similar isobaric driver configuration here on the Blessing 3, this is not a bassy IM. So if you're waiting for the bassy version of this, we don't have it yet, but we do have the Hype 2. What I will say is I think the bass quality on the Blessing 2 is actually better than the Hype 2's bass, but that is, I don't know, neither here nor no, that's actually pretty relevant. I should have mentioned it. So anyway, yeah, I think that's honestly going to do it for my thoughts here on the ThieAudio Hype 2. Out of 5 stars, I'm going to give this IM a very solid 4 stars. Again, that imaging is really just pretty fantastic. It is standout at the price, and honestly, it's standout at, like, I don't know, anything under $1,000. I'm struggling to think of things that like really do a job significantly better than the Hype 2, which is pretty good. And it's just really in again, those finer details, which if you're just getting to the hobby, might not be the things that you're necessarily gravitating toward. And so that's why I think the Hype 2 might be a pretty good place to start in the hobby. And if you're interested in checking it out, I do have it linked in the description down below. Shout out to Linsole Audio, by the way, for sending this guy in for review. I've got them linked as well. And yeah, while you're down there, if you enjoyed this video, if you found this helpful, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and join me on Discord, which I've also got linked down below. And I'll catch you in the next super review. Cheers.